Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to today's lecture on Islamophobia. This week, we've been running a mini lecture series on Islamophobia under the title Governing the Other State Power and Islamophobia in Europe. This lecture series is connected to one of the most important sort of initiatives that the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding has been pursuing for roughly a decade. And that is an initiative on Islamophobia called The.Bridge.Initiative on Islamophobia. I encourage you to check out our website for more information. Our Bridge Initiative on Islamophobia generates the most interest, judged by social media interaction, than anything else that we do here at the center. So we're very proud of the initiative, and we're very proud of organizing this lecture series on Islamophobia. Today's lecture is by Richard McNeil Wilson. He's an assistant professor in global Muslim studies at the Al-Walid Center for Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Edinburgh. Richard is he's held several prestigious postdoctoral fellowships at Leiden University in the Netherlands, a Max Weber Fellowship at the European University Institute, as well as visiting fellowships at the University of Cambridge and other prestigious universities in Europe. He specializes in critical approaches to counterterrorism and counter-extremism, including specific research on social movements and activism, Islamophobia and racism, and forms of state oppression. He's published on these themes in prominent academic journals, and he's the author of several handbooks on critical approaches to terrorism and political violence. The title of his lecture today is Securitized Islamophobia, Changing Landscapes and Trends in Counter-Extremism and Racialization in Europe. Richard, it's a great pleasure to have you here to give the talk, but also as a visiting scholar this month. We look forward to your presentation. Please join me in welcoming Richard McNeil Wilson to the Al-Walid Center. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nada. Thank you. That was very kind of you. And it's a real pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure to be at another Al-Walid Institute as well, kind of bridging ties between our institutes. And I just want to talk through some of the research that I've been doing, both at Edinburgh, but also in previous positions as well, because we have a kind of a lot of data that we've been working through as part of our work on Islamophobia and securitization and counter-extremism. And so I'm going to be kind of taking through kind of some of the findings, some of the discussions from this, from previous projects that we've been working on. Firstly, I just want to kind of contextualize the discussion in terms of thinking about racialization, about Islamophobia, about kind of where we stand within the context of the war on terror. We're at 25 years from the start of the war on terror, 20 odd years, give or take, since the 2004 Madrid bombings and the 2005 London bombings. And within this context, we have the first sort of generation of young people, particularly young Muslims, that grew up entirely within that context of the development of counterterrorism and counter-extremism. I think that's sometimes easy to forget for those of us who are slightly older, who kind of saw the events of 2001 and the start of the war on terror. And so what we really wanted to do was to dig into some of those experiences and see how young people have experienced security, concepts of security, concepts of extremism and counter-extremism from across that period, starting from 2001. Now, there's a corpus of academic work that demonstrates that Islamophobia has resulted from the war on terror and the development of subsequent counter-terrorism, not just within Europe, but worldwide. But one of the things that I want to pay attention to is that obviously being 20 to 25 years since the start of the war on terror, a lot of that securitization, a lot of that security has changed. And we're now in a kind of, in some senses, we're in a very different place than we were 25 years ago, of course, when it comes to kind of the language and the discourse used around the war on terror. Of course, within the context of the post-October 2023 and the events that took place in Palestine, we can see similar terms that have kind of come through to those that were used at the start of the war on terror. But I think it's really important to note that there have been significant changes with the kind of the development of big structures of counterterrorism and counter-extremism that exist across Europe and worldwide. And within a European context, we have the rise of radical right and anti-Islam mobilizations that have taken place, and particularly across Northern Europe, with Quran burnings, with anti-Muslim discourse, with the sort of the mainstreaming of far right and anti-Muslim and anti-migrant language within Northern Europe. This research comes from a lot of this research comes from the Drive project, which was a 3-year project that ran between the start of 2021 and the end of 2023, start of 2024. That was looking at experiences of social exclusion across Northern Europe. Now, the focus of these kind of concepts of social exclusion was in relation to security, was in relation to radicalization, was in relation to racialization. And particularly we focused on young people and their experiences of social exclusion, racialization, and counter-extremism as a way of kind of explaining some of the present context of security and securitization across Northern Europe. As part of that, we conducted about 420 interviews, largely focused on young Muslims between the ages of 18 to 25, but also young majority individuals, so young white individuals across these countries who had self-professed nationalist views. And obviously these two communities are not comparable. We're not kind of attempting to compare these two communities, but these are two communities that have been the focus of discussion around counterterrorism and counter-extremism. The focus on Muslims and Muslim communities, and the focus on the far right and nationalist communities. So it was a way of trying to understand that link between discussions and the focus of counterterrorism and counter-extremism and youth experiences of social exclusion. As I said, we did about 420 interviews, a survey of about 8,000 individuals across these countries, about 300 hours of ethnographic work. So it's a big, very heavy research-intensive project. We still have kind of some of the work online, and from this, we've got about 20 papers that have come out so far, a handbook, and I think there's plenty of other kind of research that will be coming out as part of this in the coming months and years. We're still kind of working through some of the data. But the purpose of this talk, I wanted to focus specifically on the stuff that's around Islamophobia that's coming out of this. And specifically, we have a lot of kind of papers that look just at this concept of Islamophobia and how it's been reconfigured by the rise of preventative pre-crime counterterrorism and security. So being 25 years from the start of the war on terror, from the kind of the implementation of counterterrorism, de-radicalization programs, how has Islamophobia changed? And this we kind of divided into four questions, which I'll talk through as part of this talk over the next kind of 20, 30 minutes or so. Firstly, how have young Muslims across Northern Europe experienced Islamophobia throughout their lifetimes? How do they interpret changes in Islamophobia across 20, 25 years? How do they interpret concepts of security? So how is their understanding of security changed across that period as well? How is that linked to counter-extremism, which is ostensibly conducted in order to create security? But also, how do they understand security as existing outside of the concept of extremism and terrorism, counterterrorism and counter-extremism? Where are the sites of Islamophobia? Where is Islamophobia being manifested within society for young people, and why? What are the relevance of those sites? And finally, how have young Muslims managed and mitigated these sites and trends, right? So how do we account for youth agency in responding to securitization, in trying to implement practices of de-securitization in response to experiences of securitized Islamophobia? For this data set, there was about 114 interviews, which were specifically focused on young Muslims aged between 18 and 25 across the UK, Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. We did 8 follow-up focus groups with young Muslims. These focus groups were about kind of 5 hours long. And we were a chance to kind of follow up on some of the discussions that we had in interviews. Research conducted between July 2022 and January 2024. The gender balance was relatively equal. I think we just happened to have a slight majority of male participants within that group, of 53% over female participants on 47%. And our focus was particularly on urban sites, because a lot of the discussion around radicalization tends to prioritize urban sites as being more prone to radicalization, more in need of counter-extremism measures. And so we also wanted to kind of understand those spatialities. And so we focused on two major cities, the two kind of major metropoles, the two major urban centres within each of those four countries in the UK, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Norway. Exploring with young people their experience of security, of securitization, and of Islamophobia. Now, to round off this kind of contextual discussion a little bit more, there has been a rise of counter-extremism, of pre-criminal approaches towards terrorism. And this term pre-criminal is used very openly by policymakers, it's used by practitioners as a way of describing their measures towards tackling terrorism and political violence. The UK has been one of the leaders in this. Across these four countries, the UK has been one of the leaders in the development of pre-criminal approaches towards terrorism. In 2003, we had the development of the PREVENT programme. 2006, that was made public. The PREVENT programme, for those of you who don't know, I mean, I'll delve into these very, very quickly. The PREVENT programme is a preventative approach towards countering terrorism. It's one of four pillars within the CONTEST programme. The test measures, which are the kind of broad counter-terror measures across the UK that were implemented in 2000, 2001, 2003. PREVENT started off very, very small, right? It was the younger brother of the other three pillars of CONTEST, which were much more kind of focused on responding to terrorism acts. PREVENT was much more kind of preventative, much more kind of pre-criminal. Started off very, very small, but a lot more money kind of went into it following, firstly following the 7/7 attacks in 2005 in London. And with the development of kind of sort of de-radicalization approaches, that centralization of de-radicalization and counter-extremism, and the centralization of PREVENT and of CONTEST into the Home Office in 2011. From 2015 onwards, PREVENT has become much more important as well within society, because from 2015 we've had the PREVENT duty, which has legally obligated all public sector workers, which includes anyone working in education, lecturers, school teachers, kindergarten teachers, as well as anyone working in hospitals, anyone working in mental health, anyone working in the judiciary and prison systems, to report any instances of extremism when they identify it, when they deem to identify extremism, when they think they've seen an instance of extremism, they have to report it legally under a legal obligation from the PREVENT duty in 2015 onwards. Now, when someone is reported to PREVENT, it's reported through the channel mechanisms. The channel mechanisms are a series of reporting mechanisms and monitoring mechanisms for those individuals who are reported to the PREVENT programme as being at risk of extremism, and then measured against the ERG 22+, which is a sort of a set of factors, sort of a matrix of factors by which you are supposed to be able to identify whether someone is in fact at risk of extremism and engaging in extremist behaviour. The ERG 22+ is a relatively old set of factors. I mean, they were developed quite early on in the 2000s through engagement with 22 individuals who had been arrested and prosecuted as being members of Al-Qaeda or linked to Al-Qaeda in some way. Right, so it's very much focused within that context, within the early war and terror years context. And it's been criticized as being unverifiable, subjective, and excluding political context, right? There's a set of factors that there's not an awful lot of information as to how they were developed, the original information, and the engagement with those 22 individuals is not publicly available. And it's not always clear kind of how that information is kept. In the Netherlands, we have a relatively similar system with the VERA-2R system, which is I think it's violent extremism risk assessment system, or matrices, which is in its sort of second incantation. Again, there's been concern. It's about identifying factors of individuals that are at risk to extremism. And it's been critiqued in a very good paper in 2019 that these kind of risk weightings rely strongly on gut feelings or intuition, leading to prejudice and or administrative arbitrariness in relation to preliminary risk assessment of particular youth. And by particular youth, it often means Muslims. So again, there's that racialization of young people. And within this broader context, there's been a lot of focus on like British values, Dutch values as being a way of mitigating trends of extremism, which has led to a focus on those individuals who are seen as being less British, less Dutch, largely those who come from a racialized background, minority background, largely those who are Muslim. In the Nordic countries, in Denmark and Norway, we have a slightly different kind of set of processes, which are much more grounded in what are called kind of joined up approaches towards extremism. In the 1970s, 1980s, Denmark had joined up extremism towards tackling crime, which involved bringing together schools, bringing together prisons, bringing together healthcare and mental health institutions, partnering them with police systems and police structures in order to identify early instances of engagement in crime. And these have been kind of moved over onto approaches towards extremism and counter-extremism. Within this context, Denmark and Norway are particularly notable as well for having quite a strong kind of broader political discussion on the role of Islam and a kind of a very critical negative discussion on the role of Islam within Denmark, within Norway. Norway, for instance, there's a very high reported levels of individuals who, sort of have a belief that in the sort of Eurabia conspiracy, or the kind of Muslims are taking over and they're trying to kind of remove Danish values and Danish kind of identity and Norwegian identity. And as such, there's been this sort of targeting of Muslim groups and non-Western groups. Another notable thing as well in Denmark, since 2019, there's been the ghetto packages, which are a set of packages put in place, legal packages to designate certain areas within Denmark, urban areas, if they have a certain percentage of non-Western in groups that are designated as non-Western, then those areas, those urban areas, can be designated as ghetto communities. And that means that the municipality, it means that the government can put in special measures within those areas, which include the removal of families, which include the sort of the taking down of certain communities and certain buildings. It also means that young people from non-Western backgrounds have to attend Danish lessons, Danish language lessons, Danish cultural lessons, right? So there's much more kind of racialized focus on Muslims and this problematization of Muslims particularly within Nordic societies. Now, I want to then kind of look at this relationship towards Islamophobia. So the first question is how have young people engaged with and understood and experienced Islamophobia throughout the war on terror, throughout their lives? Much of the work, particularly within a European context, in the British context, around understanding Islamophobia comes from the first sort of contemporary conceptualization of Islamophobia in 1997, which was put together by the Runnymede Trust, and came with this kind of fairly in-depth conceptualization of Islamophobia that includes exclusion, includes violence, includes prejudice, includes discrimination, and sought to kind of map this. It's a very short report, but it's been very influential in contemporary discussions of Islamophobia within the society and how it's manifested. That was 1997. If we move up towards the present day, 9th of March 9th, 2026, the UK government put in a definition. Under pressure to put in a definition of Islamophobia, they instead put in a definition of anti-Muslim hostility, which differs from this kind of definition of Islamophobia, which includes structural discussions around discrimination, prejudice, and exclusion, and focuses instead on intentionally engaging in assisting or encouraging criminal acts as being anti-Muslim hostility, in the prejudicial stereotyping of Muslims with the intention of encouraging hatred against them, or the unlawful discrimination where the relevant conduct is intended to disadvantage Muslims. And the important difference between this idea of anti-Muslim hostility, which has been adopted by the current centre-left government, Labour government in the UK, and the 1997 Runnymede conceptualization of Islamophobia, is that this contemporary idea is much more about intentionality, the intention of encouraging, the intention of disadvantaging, the intention of encouraging or conducting criminal acts. And this is very problematic, right? Because it takes away some of the structural discussion around Islamophobia, which was highlighted in the 1997 Runnymede report, and focuses it instead on criminal acts, on individuals deliberately trying to prejudice Muslims or target Muslims. Now, I have these kind of very, very long slides, you'll have to forgive me, but I wanted to prioritize some of the words that we have from interviews, some of the language that we had from interviews from young people within this discussion. So firstly, thinking of the trends of Islamophobia, when we spoke to young people about this, a lot of them highlighted the kind of the violence that they experienced, and particularly their parents experienced when they were younger. So we were talking to them about what were your parents' experience of Islamophobia, how is that different to how you experience Islamophobia now, what kind of experiences did you have growing up? A lot of them highlighted, across the 4 countries, highlighted trends of violence, experiences of violence. Growing up, I felt like my mum and dad definitely had it harder from a young British Muslim woman. A young Dutch Muslim man. 9/11 happened when I was young. I don't remember it exactly. I didn't see the impact straight away, but I remember that the language started to change. It was more hostile. It was more threatening. Another young British Muslim man, during the height of the war on terror, shortly after the London bombings, there was a lot of racism. And this persisted up until, I'd say, around 2012. And another, it was very Islamophobic, particularly talking about their mother, was very Islamophobic around 9/11, the time when she grew up. Right, so there's these experiences of violence that are being retold within a Northern European context that happened immediately after 9/11 and after 2004, the Madrid bombings, 2005, the London bombings, 2004 as well, the murder of Theo van Gogh by the Hofstad group in the Netherlands. These kind of events of violence that led to immediate kind of violence and backlash against Muslims during this period. And noted that this kind of lasted up until around 2012, and this is around the time that we start to see a change in counter-terror policy. As part of this, therefore, we see a shift, right? We see a shift in reported experience of Islamophobia, and taking the kind of the Runnymede conceptualization of Islamophobia as the basis, we can see a movement from immediately after 2001, strong experiences in reporting of violence, of prejudice, moving towards experiences of exclusion and discrimination that are currently being experienced by young people across Northern Europe. And when we ask them, you know, how you talk about these kind of violent experiences that your parents went through as Muslims living in Northern Europe immediately at the start of the war on terror, does that mean that Islamophobia has gone away? Has Islamophobia got better? Overwhelmingly, they say no. Islamophobia has not got better. Islamophobia is the same. Islamophobia has got worse. There's still a concern at the heart of this that even though the violence has gone away, even though the kind of the open prejudice has gone away, there's much more evidence of kind of exclusion and discrimination at the heart of their experiences of Islamophobia. So then we was like, well, okay, we need to unpack this. We need to understand why, even though Islamophobic violence has gone away, why is there still high levels being reported of Islamophobia? And a lot of them would link this to experiences of securitization. One young British man talked about their experience at school and the 2015 Prevent Duty. When it came in, they were sat down with one of their teachers and they said, we now need to monitor Muslim students, and you being the only Muslim student, you have to watch what you say, and you have to learn the way in which you talk about your Muslim identity. Within a Danish context, talked about all these initiatives, whether it's the ghetto legislation, the imam package, new recommendations for the headscarf ban in primary schools. All these initiatives targeted Muslims and Islam, and has helped to stigmatize and marginalize Muslims. In a Dutch context, this idea of moderate Muslims came through. They are picking up on it, of all this subtle language that's used, such as this designation between moderate Muslims and radical Muslims. And another quote from a young British Muslim man: I can feel there's certain stereotypes that you're given as a Muslim. And if you can be seen as kind of as identifying those as participating in those stereotypes, then boom, you've ticked it. There's a red flag. You're seen as a security problem, right? So there's these clear experiences of securitization we picked up from young people in the kind of the past sort of 10 years as they were going through their school and coming out of school. Now, as part of this, we can sort of broadly map, looking at some of the trends that come out of those experiences of securitization. It tells us things about the kinds of counter-terrorism and counter-extremism that are developing in different countries. So we kind of broadly can recognize, and these are as part of the paper that's still kind of coming together, we can see different experiences of securitization from the linking of Islam to concepts of radicalism, this idea of moderate and extreme Islam. We can see an experience of hyper-securitization is Islamophobia linked to the hyper-visibility of Muslim identity, particularly around the headscarf. We can see a sense of cultural exclusion, for instance, young people feeling that they're not welcome within the national culture, or they don't have access to the national culture and national identity because of their Muslimness. A lack of religious accommodation, which we saw particularly in Denmark and the United Kingdom. And I use the word lack there, and that's not quite the right word, because a lot of young Muslims, for instance, were deliberately being told they couldn't pray in school, for instance, as they were growing up. Or where they could pray on the playing field. They could pray outside. They could pray in a cupboard. They could pray in the corridor with other students walking past. Or specific surveillance of religious activities. And we can see this manifesting itself in different ways because there are different the development of different practices and conceptualizations of extremism and counter-extremism. This has resulted in different experiences of securitization and Islamophobia across the different Northern European countries. Ultimately, interviews experienced both a change, therefore, in how Islamophobia was being articulated across this period and suggested that this was due to the development of counter-extremism. And in one of our papers, in one of our work, we conceptualized this as a move from acute Islamophobia to chronic forms of Islamophobia as the result of the development of new forms of pre-criminal security and securitization. And there's one quote that I just kind of want to leave on this point, which I thought was very interesting. It was by a young British Muslim woman. And she talked about this kind of this development of chronic Islamophobia, how it's become more embedded within society, saying that there's so many young Muslims struggling and they don't realize why, they don't realize what it is, but they just have this instinct that something's not right. You just don't know where to pinpoint it because it's so subtle and so insidious. It's this idea that it's become much more embedded within society. Now, thirdly, looking at sites of securitization, where is the securitization coming from? Where is it being experienced in relation to Islamophobia? A lot of the kind of the stuff that I've done here, we've looked at how it's been manifested within education. We also see some instances of it in employment and in healthcare. But we've kind of, in our work so far, we've particularly focused on it in education. Abbas and I wrote a paper in 2025 conceptualizing this as pedagogical Islamophobia. So how it's kind of produced and reproduced within an educational context and linked to securitization and security. But we also see this spatially, and this is something that's also not addressed. So as well as a sort of the Runnymede 1977 Runnymede definition of Islamophobia, not really allowing for that much change, seeing how Islamophobia can actually change within different contexts. There's also maybe a spatial and a geographical element that's missing from this discussion on Islamophobia. And as part of this, a lot of Muslims, but also as young Muslims we spoke to, would speak of no-go areas, and I'm using this kind of language very provocatively, no-go areas for Muslims. So areas, specific sites where they as Muslims felt specifically unsafe going to. And particularly these areas were areas which were mostly all white, right? So when we talk about discussions of integration, when we talk about in Denmark, ghetto communities of parallel societies, and we talk in the UK of this idea of no-go zones, actually a lot of Muslims sort of inverted or kind of subverted this idea of these kind of areas and said, actually, it's the white areas that we feel very unsafe going into. And areas that are kind of designated as no-go, designated as not integrated, those are the areas where we feel most safe. Those are the areas where we actually get kind of resilience against the insecurity that we face every day through securitization and through kind of the threat of the state. Finally, we wanted to add some kind of discussion on the agency of young people. Like how do we understand young people and young Muslims as responding to these experiences of securitized Islamophobia? And we had various different kind of tactics that were coming through amongst the young people that we spoke to. I think from a young Danish Muslim man, I think most young Muslims have a huge reticence about politics and just have it as something they keep to themselves. In a very kind of touching interview with a young Norwegian woman, she talked about how she decided to change her last name as soon as she turned 18 in order to avoid being seen as Muslim, right? To kind of take away her Muslimness because it allowed her to access parts of Norwegian society which she felt she couldn't. be able to, as having a Norwegian name and a Muslim name and a Muslim identity. Other young people would talk about how they became much more aware of their surroundings, how they kind of fitted in, how in response to white majorities, they would be much more extroverted, much more bubbly. Think about kind of how they could become safe, make themselves approachable. And to some extent, we had some young people who would kind of seek to challenge this. At my school, we had a chemistry teacher. He was passive aggressive against Muslims. I sort of took it upon myself to challenge this, but this was only done in instances where there was a sense of safety and the sense that this could be done. So ultimately found various trends in terms of responding to this, including disconnecting with politics and the hiding of political views, hypervigilance in different situations, young Muslims seeking to make themselves less threatening or engaging in de-escalation, the masking or minimalizing of their Muslimness, overtly challenging instances of Islamophobia where it was deemed safe to do so. And we also, again, we're in an early stage of looking at this, but we also noticed there were very high levels of mental health anxieties. So as part of the interviews, we worked with a public mental health team in Cambridge, and we sought to explore their mental health and the kind of anxieties that they're having. And in relation to white majorities, young Muslims and minorities, young Muslims particularly, reported very high levels of mental health anxieties, particularly in the UK. The UK was most pronounced. I mean, we still kind of have to dig into those findings a little bit more. In terms of the overview of findings, then, what does this tell us about Islamophobia, about securitization, about where we are 25 years from the start of the war on terror? There does seem to be a discernible shift from acute forms of Islamophobia rooted in violence and prejudice to more chronic, more embedded forms of Islamophobia in discrimination and exclusion that are being experienced by young people and that are characterizing their experience as young Muslims within Northern European societies. And this is something that we see across all the 4 case studies consistently. Secondly, there was a very strong kind of sense of linking this to securitization, linked to specific experiences of securitization, and the development of national pre-crime models of counter-extremism, right? And differences in terms of how these are experienced, how securitization is understood differently within different national contexts, right? So the way in which extremism and counter-extremism is constructed within different countries leads to different experiences of Islamophobia across these different countries by young people, different reported experiences of Islamophobia. Thirdly, there's a need to kind of explore these sites of securitization a little bit more. As I said, we've kind of developed some work on pedagogical Islamophobia. There's some work that we're doing on experiences of kind of training and employment and how young Muslims sought to kind of make themselves safe within an employment context. And also to think of the community, think of spatialities, think how that challenges contemporary security conceptualizations of parallel societies, of what integration means, of what resilience means within different urban sites. And finally, there's been kind of youth responses. Chronic Islamophobia has led to novel means, right? So these are relatively new means and different means of managing these experiences of Islamophobia, which include disengagement, masking, hypervigilance, etc. What does this mean then? Just kind of zooming out as far as we can. Well, there's a possibility for reframing the discussion around Islamophobia, thinking about how Islamophobia changes, and thinking about the pluralization of Islamophobia to Islamophobias, right? We have various different kinds of Islamophobias that are appearing over time and that are shifting, are kind of creating different patterns over time. These Islamophobias interact with security and develop in relation to counterterrorism and counter-extremism, particularly within the development of national, and again, I want to emphasize that idea of national pre-crime approaches. Thirdly, there's a potential for updating core conceptualizations of Islamophobia based on the examination of new and novel sites of securitization and Islamophobia. And finally, we need to center youth responses. So securitization offers some explanation here, but it's much more complex than the kind of conceptualization of securitization and the conceptualization of Islamophobia has allowed for to date. So securitization only offers a partial explanation of experiences by young Muslim youth, And there's also an urgent need for accounting for the agency of young Muslim youth in managing and mitigating these experiences of Islamophobia, and essentially engaging in counter-securitization practices in which they try to roll back experiences of securitization. So this is about kind of where we are. There's a couple of papers. There's one critical substance terrorism on this acute chronic Islamophobia. There's one that came out quite recently in Race, Ethnicity and Education, where we dig into how Muslims confront pedagogical Islamophobia. More of these papers will be coming out as we kind of dig through the findings. But that kind of gives us this is kind of a rough overview of where we're going with some of these discussions on Islamophobia and how they relate to practices of counter-extremism. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Great. Thank you very much, Richard. Do you want to stand there or you want to have a seat for the Q&A?
I'll sit down. Yeah,
okay. Just an initial sort of question of clarification that you mentioned in your presentation. Could you explain in greater detail the difference in your critique of this 2026 definition of anti-Muslim hostility that the Labour government came up with versus the concept of Islamophobia as first articulated in the Runnymede report? You seem to be critical of this newer definition of anti-Muslim hostility, and the earlier Islamophobia definition by the Runnymede Trust seemed to be much more substantive and much more sort of analytically useful in terms of understanding this broad phenomena. What are the pros and cons or the comparative differences between these two definitions?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's really about understanding that Islamophobia is structural, right? And I think much of this work is about demonstrating that structural Islamophobia is much more important, right? And we need to understand this much more crucially than instances of irregular violence that characterized much kind of earlier articulations of Islamophobia.
Yes.
There's an attempt, I mean, my understanding of this attempt of this definition by the UK government is there was pressure on them to adopt a definition of Islamophobia.
Yeah.
There was an all-party parliamentary group which recommended this, which recommended a definition, or at least an adopting of a definition of Islamophobia. What the UK government has done instead is that it's adopted this idea of anti-Muslim hostility, right? And this centering of hostility, the centering of it's a centering of violence. I mean, and the first kind of the first idea that they put forward in this 2026 government definition is about irregular acts of anti-Muslim hostility, right? And of course, whilst that's bad, what we're showing is, or what the kind of the data from young people is showing us, is that that's not their core concern. They're not worried about these kind of irregular acts of violence. It's not the same as it was 20, 25 years ago. They're really concerned, and they're really, experiencing difficulties and social exclusion and mental health problems because they're experiencing structural experience of Islamophobia. And that's not something that's accounted for within the government definition, right? It's all about an intention. If you have an intention to do it, then it's anti-Muslim hostility. But anything that's kind of structural and doesn't have that overt intention doesn't fall under that definition, and therefore isn't of interest. So there's a need to kind of recenter that kind of definition. And the Runnymede Trust does that much more effectively in terms of understanding that it can be both a structural thing and irregular.
So that was my clarification question. Now, one sort of big question about this whole phenomena of Islamophobia, and it's really a question of comparing this phenomena in Europe as opposed to the United States. And that revolves around the question of economic class. So one of the interesting sort of differences that we see is that American Muslims here tend to be much more economically integrated and successful compared to Europe. And so the levels of Islamophobia that apply to young kids in Europe in terms of their unemployment, exclusion, lack of hope, opportunity, generally speaking, in the American context, are not as salient because, they come from different backgrounds, they tend to be more successful, and that economic class component tends to, at least in the American context, have a different effect in terms of the level of Islamophobia, according to one argument. Do you have any thoughts on sort of that comparative sort of similarity and difference revolving on the question of economic class?
I think it's really interesting. I don't know. I wouldn't want to comment too much on the US context because I don't feel like I know an awful lot on the US context in terms of Islamophobia. But I do agree that it's issues of class and issues of I mean, much of this research was about social exclusion, right? So it's looking at societal inequalities, how they're experienced.
And there's certainly very, very strong evidence that that a lot of young Muslims and Muslim communities across Northern Europe aren't, as you said, as economically integrated as they are in the US. And that has significant implications. It has significant implications in the way in which Muslims are framed and Muslim communities are problematized. And I mean, in the UK, that's seen a kind of a convergence of kind of anti-migration language with Islamophobia.
Yeah.
In a lot of kind of central or kind of countries like Denmark, countries such as Norway, a problematization of Muslims as being able to access national forms of identity, right? Because they're seen as an other, they're seen as existing outside.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's partially about class, it's partially about socioeconomics, but it's also partially about kind of this kind of story of Europe that is often put forward by politicians, that Islam exists as an other, as a very clear other, to a kind of a very constructed idea of a European and European national identity.
Yeah. Great. Let's turn the floor open to comments or questions. And if no one volunteers, I'll keep asking you questions, but I see a hand right there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a silly question, but on my Twitter, I always see like Tony Robinson and other major accounts talking about how London isn't white anymore, and across its identity. And I saw that you didn't include London in the list of cities.
It was, it was, yeah.
Sorry,
I might have left it out.
I didn't get the quote. Didn't include who?
London.
And
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, we did. I might have. Yeah, it was London and Manchester in the UK, but I may have left it off. Yeah.
Okay. Second question that I have is about preventative counterterrorism. On one of the slides, it said that a lot of it was based off of intuition. So is this personal intuition, or is this algorithmic, or like does AI have anything to do with it, or like, how does that exactly work?
No, that's a really interesting point. A lot of the preventative approaches are become very highly racialized, right? Because they're trying to spot risk. And the language around this has sort of moved increasingly away from spotting instances of violence to spotting instances of violent extremism, to spotting instances of extremism, to spotting instances of being at risk or having vulnerabilities to extremism, right? So this target, right, where public sector workers have to identify extremism in the UK has become much broader, and also become rooted in the concept of national values, British values, European values. As a result, a lot of, it's very difficult to identify extremism. I mean, I struggle to do it, and I do it full time as a job, right? And I've done it for 10, 15 years, right? But instead you have kind of teachers, and you have kindergarten teachers, right? Who have to kind of try and identify instances of extremism in a 4 or 5-year-old, right? And the result is it creates a process where there's this legal obligation where you have to do something, but it becomes very racialized because you're reliant on your idea of what a terrorist is, your idea of what extremism is, your idea of what an individual not participating in British values or Danish values or Dutch values is. And as a result, that intuition often leads to over-representation of Muslim and minority communities being reported to, being pushed to prevent, being reported to the safety houses in the Netherlands or in Denmark for concerns of extremism. Now, sometimes that doesn't lead anywhere, right? Oftentimes there'll be a review and the police will be involved, and it will then kind of go nowhere, and they'll be like, this isn't an extremism concern. But the worry with that is, of course, you still, in many cases, you still have police turning up at your door, right? And which is not a pleasant experience at the best of times, but especially if you're from a minority community, there's implications there as well to having, national police turning up on your door, asking about extremism, asking about terrorism. There's also not a lot of information about where that data is kept, how long that's kept for, whether that will turn up or result in kind of being flagged at a later stage. And as the result, you have that kind of that intuition that is required by public sector workers to report on those that they work with, is leading to and reproducing that racialized sense of threat, particularly amongst young people.
John?
Speculative question here. So you talked about kind of the expanding domain of preventative counter-extremism. And you've described how teachers will identify students who are supposedly exhibiting signs of extremism. And my question is, does that expanding scope of preventative counter-extremism itself have an impact, like it creates a social exclusionary environment and incidents and episodes in a child's life that then exacerbates that feeling of otherness and perhaps in fact leads to extremism?
Yeah, so that's one thread that definitely can be followed, and the work that we've done as part of the Drive project was on those links between social exclusion and violence in some senses, right? It was much more broader, kind of the interviews that we had and the discussions that we had, but it was also making the point that social exclusion can lead towards the very kind of issues that you're trying to respond to and trying to kind of take away.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm thinking of is that there's kind of the chronic or indirect instances of social exclusion in the form of systemic discrimination, etc.
Yeah.
Then there's the like direct or acute episodes of social exclusion when you have the police show up at your door, because of your child or what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the research as well was looking at social exclusion more broadly, and does this apply, how does this apply to other communities? Does this apply to those individuals who are engaging in nationalist politics, right? If you are part of a radical right group or radical right youth group in the Netherlands or in Denmark or in Norway, what are your experiences of social exclusion? Do you also have that kind of negative connotation with the police, with counterterrorism, with counter-extremism? And to some extent, we also saw that there as well, right? So it's not just a racialized problem; it's a problem that is absolutely endemic within the construct of pre-criminal approaches towards violence.
I'll say,
I'm so sorry that I missed the first part of your presentation, but I guess I have two questions. The first is, to what extent has the resurgence of nationalism in Europe affected Islamophobia? Yesterday, Ogo shared with us critical junctions in Europe that kind of had an impact. Would you consider nationalism as a critical juncture, or that led to what you call different kinds of Islamophobias? We don't only have one kind of Islamophobia. Having mentioned Ogo, this is my second question. I'd like to grab a wedge between you and Ogo a little bit. Namely, you suggested that securitization provides a limited explanation to understanding Islam. And I guess Ogo spoke extensively yesterday about securitization. So I just want to hear more about it. Can you expand a little bit more?
Yeah, of course. No, yeah, good questions. I think, yes, the rise of the far right is a critical juncture to Islamophobia, but Islamophobia, and I think the structured Islamophobia of counterterrorism has been particularly powerful in driving the mainstreaming of far right movements and radical right movements. And I would slightly flip it and put it in the other direction and say maybe that process is more important, in that the way in which counter-extremism and counterterrorism has been constructed and shared by politicians and by media has allowed for radical right groups to develop, even in instances where those kind of counterterrorism, counter-extremism structures have said that they're focused on the far right. There's been studies, for instance, that have shown that the way in which concepts of British values are taught by teachers in relation to counter-extremism and the prevent duty have a lot to do and are very similar to far-right constructions of British values, right? What it means to be British. And again, like very racialized ideas of what it means to be British, very kind of Christian and secular ideas of what it means to be British, and very anti Islam and anti-minority constructions of what it means to be British. So the way in which counterterrorism is being constructed and counter-extremism is being constructed is to me one of the core drivers, the core sort of motors in the rise of far right groups, even in instances where counter-extremism says that it's working against the far right. And in terms of securitization, there's a lot to be done on securitization. There's a lot of problems, I think, with securitization that needs to be dug into more. And we were speaking about this a bit yesterday as well, about the kind of, what are the limits of this idea of securitization? When does it stop? When do we stop securitizing? When do we desecuritize? Or what is counter-securitization? Is it the fact that with the prevent duty, we can see with the development of these pre-criminal approaches in all these four countries, we can see that new pre-criminal approaches have gone from being particularly focused in certain areas to going into other areas such as education, such as employment, and that has had an impact. But what is the means of reversing that? Is there a means of reversing that? What role does the ideas of securitization play in potentially thinking about the disestablishment of pre-criminal approaches and counter-extremism approaches, which I think is a good strategy. We should be thinking about the disestablishment of counter-extremism, counter-terror approaches, because they are causing more harm than good in my understanding. And desecuritization and securitization theories potentially play a role in understanding that, but there's big limits to that. There needs to be kind of much more radical means of deploying and critiquing securitization theory to think about, okay, how do we reverse these trends? How do we build something else and reconceptualize this idea of what security is? Because if you speak to young people, if you speak to Muslim communities, a lot of them will have a completely different understanding of what security is, and we need to be thinking of ways to emphasize that form and not the state form.
Yes.
Hi, Harish. It's not about securitization. I will get back to the point about pre-crime. I was just curious if in the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway, there is anything similar to the prevent duty that there is in the UK.
The EU has required all member states to have a preventative approach towards counter-extremism, and the EU itself has adopted the prevent structures, at least in part, right? So there's a very strong European case that's being made, and even with the UK not part of the EU anymore, the EU has still often follows UK approaches towards preventative pre-criminal responses to extremism. Within the Netherlands, yes, there are very similar processes as in the UK with prevent, a very similar kind of set of systems. Within Denmark and Norway, I don't think it's quite the same, but it's still very joined up, right? It's this joined up approach that they have towards countering extremism that is very strongly embedded within educational systems, embedded within prison systems, embedded within healthcare systems, right? Which is slightly different in the way it's conceptualized, and is much more is less securitized, right? So another critique of securitization is myself and a colleague were looking at kind of, does securitization apply in the same way in Denmark? Because maybe it doesn't quite apply in the same way, because actually it's much more about social welfare, and maybe we need to dig into that a bit more, and it's less about security or the security in a way. So yes, but there's enough overlaps, and there's enough kind of sense that these pre-criminal approaches have pervaded various parts of the society, that they are having an impact on Muslims across them.
So like teachers have to report.
They're not legally obligated in the same way, but there's still kind of and there's much more focus, I think, on communities, on mainland European countries than there is in the UK. This concept of security sort of disappeared from like 2011 onwards. At the start, it was very, because prevent actually used to be within the Department of Community and Local Government, so it was very much up until 2011 under the sort of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown governments. The shift in 2011 took it away from communities, and now it's not quite in that sense.
Okay, last question to Jonathan.
I'm wondering, what do you say to the argument that you can't prove the counterfactual? So just from the sense of, oh, you can't prove that this program, the prevent program and approaches like it, don't in fact stop episodes of violence, of mass violence. And what role do you think that argument has in the constant expansion of the securitization domain? That oh, well, you can't prove the counterfactual that these approaches aren't working. And so the best practice from a risk assessment perspective is to continue expanding.
It's a good point. I think there's a good quote by Richard Jackson, who writes on critical terrorism studies, and he said that this idea of extremism and counter-extremism represents a sort of a crisis within this idea of terrorism and counter-terrorism, right? This crisis point where actually it's very difficult to identify, and so we just keep broadening it out. We keep broadening it out because if we broaden out, we're doing something, right? The politicians are doing something to respond. You don't get a lot of political capital from saying I'm going to do less of counter-terrorism and counter-extremism, right? So from a political point of view, it's very understandable that it's this desire to do kind of more and more. And it's true, you can't prove a counterfactual, but you can't prove it either way, right? You can't prove that this has not prevented attacks, but you also can't really prove that this has prevented attacks, right? Because you have, how do you prove that someone has gone through the prevent system and then actually they've not carried out an attack? Because if you are going to carry out an attack, right, also it's worth noting, if you are seen as an imminent security threat, prevent doesn't go anywhere near you, right? It's straight to the police, and this is a police matter. And this is the point, right? This is why I'm very much anti-counter-terror law. There's so many laws in place already about kind of, responding to individuals, responding to violence, responding to murder, responding to hate crime, that there's no need for all of these kind of extra approaches. So a lot of them are just kind of about having political capital and looking like you're responding to the threat of terrorism, the threat of extremism. But there's been this drive to, particularly within the UK and Denmark, I think this drive to focus more on like risk and vulnerability, right? Because it sounds less about violence, it sounds and less about politics. It sounds more about like, oh well, it's just like other forms of risk. It's just like child abuse. It's just like sexual abuse. It's just like other kind of forms of abuse that you might suffer, or grooming, for instance. And of course, you want to respond to that. And that's really what counter-extremism is, this framing that counter-extremism is not political, it's colorblind, it's just based on, supporting individuals who are vulnerable. But it's a very dangerous language, I think, because it's an attempt to, again, like remove the politics, remove the context from political violence, and to really embed counter-extremism within society, and but also at the same time to make it less visible, right? So rather than arguing now about whether counter-extremism is having the impact that it should do, the language has changed from a policymaker's point of view of we're just protecting vulnerable people, right? And why would you want to not protect vulnerable people? It's about vulnerability, it's about support, and that's quite pernicious because it really embeds those securitizing systems and makes them very, very hard to spot and very hard to kind of respond to.
Great. So I think you've answered sort of one of my questions here, but let me just make sure that you have. If the existing preventative counter-extremism policies and programs haven't worked because they are sort of embedded in or they foster Islamophobia, the question would then be, well, what's the alternative plan or policy? And so are you suggesting that, look, we have existing laws to deal with questions of violence. We don't need a special program under the label of preventing counter-extremism. We can just use the existing laws to deal with any acts of violence wherever they happen and whoever they're from. Is that a correct interpretation?
That's one facet that I would put forward. But the fact that there's so much link between social exclusion, between austerity politics, between the kind of this kind of class-based discussion and inequality and political violence as well that's being shown, is that actually that it therefore means that we need to, we urgently need to be addressing those issues, right? And counter-extremism or countering extremism will come about as a result of addressing these core issues around inequalities, around social exclusion, around the kind of the massive cutting of safety nets within societies that's taken place since kind of 2008 onwards. so there needs to be I think, much more, in a sense, it's a much more holistic approach towards thinking about this issue that takes away the security aspect or massively deprioritizes the security aspect and thinks of it as a societal problem, right? And it's not really been addressed as a societal problem in that way.
Good, very good. Very good. Thank you very much, Richard, for being with us and sharing with us your research. Very insightful and educational. Please join me in thanking Richard Neil Wilson.